really sitting at the intersection of that space of, how do you run great product teams and how do you leverage yourself using AI is Emma Burrows, who is formerly the CTO of Stripe, but now a startup founder and CEO herself. Um, and she's building a company called Resonant, which is, I will give a very brief description of because I'm sure she will do it much better. But it's basically, I understand, like a product brain that helps you kind of pull together lots of different sources of information and decide what to build. Um, she's going to talk to us about how to move from using AI to orchestrating agents. So, Emma, I'll hand over to you.
Great, thank you. Also, just a slight correction, Stripe UK. I would have loved to be CTO for Stripe overall, but actually it was just in the UK. So yeah, I always feel very embarrassed when it sounds like I was CTO for the whole of Stripe. And Ed's got his cat. I've got my kids in the background, so hopefully this is going to run smoothly. But if you hear a bit of background noise, then apologies for that. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a bit about, we've really been on a kind of journey as part of building Resonant. We started building Resonant as a kind of product workspace, which is a place for you to come and shape all of your product documents and build prototypes and, almost kind of feedback directly on top of your web apps and things like that. But what we then realized was that the problem more and more was how do you make enough space to think about the problems that matter and automate the problems that don't. And so we built this kind of product brain, which is very scrappy. And I'll show you what we built internally. And we've now worked with a few design partners to start doing this with them as well. But our main application, Resonant, is kind of where we got a lot of those learnings from. And so I'll reference it, but it's not directly what we're talking about today. So for a little bit of context about me, this is where I have worked in the past. So a combination of kind of big tech, but also ecom, which as any ecom folks here will know runs very differently from a kind of like engineering process perspective. Before that, I was also at Google as both an engineer and a product manager. And so always spent, a bit of time as both PM and engineer and done a little bit of both. So if you think about what has happened in coding in the past, particularly 6 months, there has been a huge transformation in terms of the amount of code that is now written almost entirely by AI. Anyone that spends a lot of time in this space will know that very fast-moving AI native teams, their engineers are now operating across 5 different kind of agents that are writing the code for them. And whereas engineering, which used to be one of these incredibly deep focus activities, has now moved to really kind of orchestrating these agents, in our opinion, nobody has done the same for the craft of product management. And so the consequence of that is that PMs are getting pulled a lot into the kind of day-to-day and not having enough space to think about the problems that matter, which is why we started looking and thinking about this problem. So if you compare this to where software engineering has come from last year in terms of AI usage, engineers were probably in this more using AI camp, and that's using things like Copilot to edit line by line or help them write kind of small blocks of code. And then over the course of the last year, those blocks got progressively bigger to the point that now you're describing full features, full products even, and moving into this kind of agent orchestrator camp. And actually, if we think about the tooling that has gone on at the same time, taking PMs through this kind of workflow also is something that we haven't seen the tooling emerge for yet. So I'm sure a lot of people use ChatGPT or Claude, etc., for kind of running, helping them to draft things, maybe even running mini workflows, but moving into that kind of like top right-hand segment is something that takes quite a lot of work to do for the PM craft, right? There's a lot of thought and judgment and pulling together a lot of different input sources to do product management well. If you think about software engineering, so I mentioned about kind of Cursor and Copilot, and then we went into kind of Claude Code where, the actual code being written didn't matter, and even up towards OpenClaw if you're brave enough or stupid enough, depending on how you look at it, to run it against a bunch of different tools and systems autonomously. So why is it harder for PMs to do this? I don't think this will be a surprise to any of this audience. There are lots of different inputs to making a good decision. It's what happened 2 years ago when you last tried this experiment. It is, the 500 tickets you have in your backlog, that tiny piece of insight that a customer gave you on a call, and then how do you actually make the right decisions on top of that? But to do so in a way that is still going to respect your taste and judgment when appropriate. So that's the real challenge of kind of like creating this autonomous PM system. So in order to do that, what we have been thinking about is this concept of a product brain. So rather than working at the level of you or an individual session, this aims to encode your organizational context when it comes to product thinking. So it takes a bunch of inputs, maybe you've got mail, Granola, whatever is relevant, and we'll talk about how shape of business needs to map to how product brain thinks about things in a minute. And it creates this kind of self-maintaining wiki because it's great to have a product brain. Everybody, I'm sure, knows that they have to go to like 3 different tools to get the full context about stuff. If it isn't an auto-maintaining system, actually, the first kind of thing we learned was that it doesn't work very well. You need the system to stay fresh, to stay up to date, or it's useless. And it also needs to work where you work. So I'll talk about how we use Slack as this kind of like human agent interface for these conversations. So then you create this middle kind of wiki and then configure a bunch of workflows that can be whatever you want on top of it to target, the kind of jobs that you're doing as a product manager. But ideally, I think to really get into this top corner of agent orchestration, you're trying to do the actual process from ideation to shipping code of product management rather than, maybe just writing a brief or something. That's our objective when we talk about agent orchestration. So in terms of what this actually looks like, let me just bring this up. So this is a visualization of the wiki, but for us, I've anonymized all of these inputs, so it runs on our kind of like demo structure. We've got these 3 different inputs. We've got Granola for customer conversations, linear, and GitHub. And the idea is that this runs on a regular basis, pulls in the relevant information. Obviously, you want to define the cadence of these operations to be token conservative or less token conservative if you enjoy token maxing. But the most important thing is it maps to how your organization runs. So if you aren't an organization that updates linear a huge amount, it probably doesn't need to run every hour, etc. And then we create this wiki over the top of it. This is kind of like a visualization of our product brain. But actually, all product brain is under the hood is a GitHub repo. And we use a GitHub repo under the hood because we think it's pretty important that people are able to stuff their own inputs into product brain and also audit it, edit it, etc. As appropriate. So for anyone that is familiar with the kind of way that OpenClaw was created and some of the kind of like Andre Karpathy concepts, we've used a lot of those, but on a like kind of team and organizational level. So the actual product brain that we have here is got a set of inputs, it's got a set of sources and a wiki. So basically the way that this works is whenever you configure your inputs to run, they pop into these folders. So you can see here, like in the Granola folder, for example, we've got a dog feeding session that we did on Friday, and then the bunch of kind of like linear tickets that have been updated. And all of this is just sitting there until the product brain runs. I'll try and pay attention to any questions. And then it will go into the sources folder. So basically what will happen is all of this stuff will end up in a combination of sources and wiki. But what the wiki is aiming to do is to represent your product, your judgment, and how you think about decisions made on top of it. So you can see here that within ours, we've got some kind of customer insights folders, features, product principles, etc. And we can look at this and understand like, so you can see here it's got source references that links it back to the customer insights that we've got and kind of explains and talks through how we're thinking about our kind of product vision here. So that's the kind of like core concepts. What we can see here is an example of when it ran. I'm going to try and get off GitHub because I know it's not the most interesting thing. But when it runs over these inputs, it basically updates as surgically as possible to explain exactly what has happened. So you can see here, it's noted that 2 of the source tickets were cancelled, and mentioned that it wants to not build this until the PRD is kind of finalized, essentially. So,
Emma,
yeah,
sorry, really quick one from me, it's Susanna. We've got a question in the chat about whether you could open one of the linear MD files or describe the structure.
yeah, 1 second. So,
Sorry, I thought I'd just ask it while you were there and before you moved on.
yeah, so this has just basically got some metadata, and also got the content of the ticket. So this is clearly not a very good, not a very good ticket, but it would essentially just copy that information across from Linear so that it can then use that without having to go and consume tokens to go and get it. But the more important bit is the kind of synthesizing of that data into the wiki. Elizabeth just asked, can you explain the benefit you see on a daily basis from this approach? Speed, taste, team collaboration. Yes, let me explain how we actually use this, and then hopefully that will answer that question. So in here, we can configure workflows. So basically what this allows us to do is to configure a bunch of workflows that we can then trigger from Slack, or trigger automatically on a weekly basis, for example, things like customer insights, etc. And I can show you what this looks like here. So I have set up a workflow that triggers whenever a linear ticket comes in, and I'm going to trigger that now. So I'm just going to create a linear ticket here, and I've got a example here. Oh, 1 second. So this is something that we've had a couple of times. Let me give a bit of context on what Resonant does. So Resonant is, as I said, a kind of product workspace. And within a given kind of project, you can see a set of tasks. And so we've had the request a couple of times. You can see here we're talking about some product brain stuff, I think, specific to Posthog. But people want to know how complex a given task is. So that's been a request from a couple of our customers. And so what I'm asking here to the Slack bot is to basically do this. So you can imagine if you've got a channel with sales, for example, they maybe want to ping and say like, hey, I've got this user feedback. Can you do this feature? Or, hey, where does this sit in the backlog? Have the engineers finished this piece of work, etc. It's great for all those kind of requests, or even to start actioning linear tickets automatically. So I'm just going to submit this ticket and try and explain the answer to Elizabeth's question. So when I submit that, the agent is going to go off and try and understand how this fits strategically into our plans. And it will then respond appropriately with, does it want to write a PRD? Does it think this is a well-scoped ticket? Or actually, does it need only a small clarification to make it well-scoped and ready for building? So while it's doing that, I'm going to explain the previous example. So this one here is some confusion about our product charter feature, which says users are confused about the feature shown on the homepage. They don't know what it is, and they have no way to see it or understand it better. So just for some context, this is this thing here. You specify it during onboarding, but then we don't have a really great way of allowing the user to understand it. So when I submitted this, you can see here that the agent has actually given its opinion that like the scope is pretty concrete. Here's what it thinks we should do in order to fix this particular issue reported by the user. And then it's identified that strategically we can either wait for some onboarding work and some changes to the UI that is happening. So because it's got that deep context, it understands there's some more broader work going on. But it said like, this is a very small fix. Like I can just implement this. I think we should go ahead. And so what I said was, yeah, okay, great. Let's actually implement that. And we can see here on the ticket that it has implemented that and then actually implemented the fix for it as well. So you can see here, It wrote up a full spec for the change and then has actually written the PR required to do this kind of end-to-end behavior. So now for the things that are kind of small that your users might be asking for, that you're like, oh, I know I have to take this through a process. It's just going to take a bunch of my time. I'm just going to like kind of ship that through the process fairly quickly. And the objective then is to give you the space and time to work on the things that actually matter. So this is probably still working through. Elizabeth, does that help to kind of like bring that to life a bit better?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Okay, cool. While that's working, let me run through a few more of the slides as context. All right, we've kind of been through this. So for anyone familiar with the concept of kind of loop engineering, who's familiar with the concept of loop engineering? Cool. Couple of hands. So the idea is we think of this as the product factory part of software factories. So with software factories, the idea is you kind of like put some inputs in and then have a good enough kind of QA and testing system that the whole thing can kind of like almost self-ship. We think that there is a kind of loop above this, which is how do you take inputs from customers and start to self-ship those? And so from a kind of process perspective, you can see that there are different levels of signal that you get at different kind of points of conversation. So if you're someone who's doing a lot of prototyping, there's two ways those are used, internally or externally. If you're using them internally, the signal is less, but they're a lot easier to build. If you're using them externally, you start to get the actual signal from customer. Or you can try and actually ship something all the way to production, get it in the hands of customers, and that's obviously the richest data. So if we look here at two different kind of forms of companies, so let's imagine you're a sales-led growth company. Your main input from a kind of customer perspective is probably inputs to the sales team. And so you can think through like, which of these parts do you want to start to allow your sales team to maybe do experiments around, etc. And then on the product-led growth, actually your data is likely to be much more analytical. That's why you saw the kind of task around post hoc. And the idea is that then ideally you have a system where you can kind of roll it out, monitor the data, and kind of feed that all the way back through. So the place that a PM aims to get to is they're orchestrating across several agents that are kind of scoping things, making sure that's getting through to engineering correctly, and then spending the time similarly to engineers architecting the bigger features on the things that matter from a strategic perspective, maybe the more blue sky thinking aspects of the role. Now let me go back to the demo. So we can see here that the agent has flagged that there's a sibling ticket here, and there's slightly different trigger points. But it's recommending that we fold this into a single PRD here with one kind of ambiguity surface so that we don't end up kind of implementing this as a one-off scoring widget. So whereas before the agent recommended well scoped, not completely contradicting what's already happened, let's just ship it. This time it's recommending that we roll it in with a kind of bigger feature. And so if I respond and I say to it like, I wouldn't actually do this, but I'll say, actually, I want a PRD now because I think this is different. It's going to go off and write this PRD, but it's also going to remember that particular insight that it got the wrong answer, and it's going to feed that back into its memory and principles system so that over time your comfort, trust of the agent improves and its understanding of your product improves as well. Any questions on what I've kind of shown there in terms of the demo? Ed?
Yeah, you see, it kind of remembers that insight, and so it does, uses that judgment for later. How are you codifying that? Is that a sort of like set of additional instructions, in this case do that, in this case do that, or are you kind of somehow rewriting the system prompt and running it against some evals or test cases?
Yeah, so basically what happens, actually, I can probably show this in the product brain. If you give me 1 second. Okay, so basically what happens is that session that we just had, not the one that we were right in the middle of, will go into this session input. So you can see here, like it's taken all that Slack correspondence and the agent recommendation and what I said and put it in the session so that it can always be referenced back directly, but then it feeds into the wiki and the principles. So that it's all built around this like central brain concept. Okay, few questions here. Let me just, yeah. How are engineering teams receiving these types of changes? I mean, I think there are different kinds of engineering teams. So the most common example of like a workflow that this supports really well, but which I think is quite easy, is like a customer insights weekly report, or that kind of like report you get for like updates before a weekly planning meeting, for example. And so those are like much less controversial. And so I've kind of shown the most advanced use case of this, which is trying to ship the code all the way to production. But the idea is to build the brain that backs whatever the process is and whatever the level of comfort is within a particular culture and team organization, etc. So I would say that's how people are tweaking it for their engineers' level of comfort. The really forward-looking companies, I would say, are like still not pushing all the way to that level of code in production necessarily, but they are asking for the ability for like salespeople to start spinning up prototypes, for example, so that the salespeople can communicate their points more effectively without having to bother PMs or engineers for some of those initial conversations. Then someone said it's brilliant for a specific kind of org, small single source of truth, high test coverage, high trust and autonomous agents. We're not that org today and probably won't be for a while, given where we are with tooling and governance. Yeah, I think this is the tricky thing at the moment about like where AI is taking organizations, that, some of the kind of fastest moving teams versus teams which are kind of stuck with some of the governance questions are diverging quite a lot, whereas we've been in a period of time where product processes have been quite kind of consistent and well understood, obviously still variation between a small company and a big company. So I think it'll be interesting to see how this evolves over time. For bigger organizations, I think they tend to value the product brain on its own and not necessarily the automations around them. And they value it from the perspective of aligning strategy decisions. So you can use the product brain, for example, with Claude to help, shape roadmaps, critique documents as well, just as part of your day-to-day, more co-pilot kind of style of interaction. Okay, lots of questions. How have you enabled UX review sign-off for the straight to shipping flow? Yes, so we do have a version of this, which I didn't show today, that basically has a set of users in it who the agent can ping specifically if it has questions. So for example, you can put design guidance in there. You can say like, our designer is a guy called Sam. Sam is our designer. Ping him if you feel like this is a substantial UX feature and you want him to provide input on it. Because that's definitely a common part of the kind of flow. And then how are organizations' strategic priorities reaching the product brain? Are they tracked for changes? Yes. So the inputs here, what you can also add is manual inputs as well. So for example, if your organization has got roadmaps and you're not storing those in the product brain, then you can put them in manually. We can also suck them out of Notion. We can suck them out of Google Docs. Google Docs is slightly annoying, actually, etc. So that way it should stay aligned with the strategic priorities of a company. All right, let me just wrap up the slides and then we can maybe do a few more questions. Okay, so this is our kind of like recommendation in terms of getting started. We're happy to chat to people if you're interested in chatting about product brains in general. People can also start building themselves if they're interested, and this is kind of like where we started, was trying to kind of map where the initial signals live. It's a surprising amount of information you can get out of just a few input sources, particularly if one of them is GitHub, your ticketing system, and you're using it well. Admittedly, we weren't in the example I showed. And just with a couple of inputs, you can get a pretty rich product brain. In fact, if anything, I think you want to avoid adding too many over time. And then, kind of picking the workflows that are important to you and trying to also work out the kind of trust boundaries as to what you do want to automate are the things that we would recommend in terms of getting started. But yeah, this is our link, our QR code. I'm also available on LinkedIn under Emma Burrows. So feel free to ping me about it. All right, I'm going to continue going through some questions. How much of this is enabling a PO to become an engineer, and how much is it helping the upstream elements of the role? Curious if you've hooked into external data sources to predict features itself. So the external data sources that we have hooked into for us personally are Granola. As you saw in the kind of example, we're working on hooking into Posthog as well for our analytics, which will then help to kind of close that loop. And I think that in terms of the question, it depends again on your workflows as to how much it either helps upstream or helps a PM to kind of ship end to end. It can kind of do both aspects depending on the workflows that are implemented. How do you make sure that you still know of the main issues that are required? If those are entered directly into the brain, won't you be required to create different processes or gating of those? Ioana, are you on the Zooms?
Yeah. So my question is, I feel like the product manager were some kind of gatekeeper, correct? Of so many people that are asking for so many things, and you need to decide what is worth proceeding and what not, correct?
Yeah.
And I think that it's an amazing thing to have an additional brain. What I am a little bit suspicious about is that if you have this Slack open to salespeople and to everyone, and everyone can put their own requests there, and you're not reviewing them in real time with them, or you will need to have additional processes now to go through the new databases and what was entered, and then go back to the stakeholders and explain ask them what did they mean. And so I wonder, how do you decide this? If you thought about it, and if you have some kind of thoughts about how to limit this or not to limit it, because
Yeah, I think we were discussing the idea actually of having a specific workflow for pushing back when appropriate. We're trying to think about how to shape that in a way that feels helpful. You can see that the agent did it a little bit in terms of saying that actually there's already a ticket over here for that feature that's being requested. Our goal with having the kind of product brain and it trying to encode taste and judgment is not that just it becomes a route for salespeople to just ship whatever their customer wants, because they don't have the incentives of creating a great long-term product experience that a product manager has. But there are also sometimes kind of quick wins that otherwise they end up on the backlog because nobody's really got time to kind of think about them. That can mean a lot to a salesperson as well, and can actually mean they're much more involved and feel much more kind of respected in the process. But I think it's a very careful balance. Yeah. Like all things with agents, it's just making sure you use them well and not ship a bunch of slop.
Yep. Thank you.
Is there a benefit of having product brain done in an AI tool that is also used by engineering like Kiro? Does it make no difference to do discovery PRDs in some other app and then give cold start requirements to engineers? I'm just trying to interpret this question. So the product brain itself can be used by something like Kiro and actually like you can link to it in your main repo using like a symlink from an engineering perspective. So that's not really a kind of like issue. But in terms of kind of like doing discovery and PRDs and then handing them over to engineers with a kind of cold start problem, I haven't seen that as kind of a huge issue as long as the requirements are well specified and your product brain is like working effectively.
Yeah, is it okay if I jump on that, Emma?
Yeah, please.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for the answer. The reason I ask is because we're actually building Product Brain in my company in Kiro, because it can do that to a certain extent, but we're just still kind of just enthusiasts. But the reason why we think it's good to sit it in the engineering space is because we want to take a next step with introducing synthetic personas. To add them into the end of the life cycle. So yes, Product Brain would help get us to PRD and maybe even prototype and maybe even something shippable. But then if that also knows and tells the engineering tools they use to then run it by those synthetic agents who hold our personas data behind, then it kind of nicely completes the loop and kind of tells us what we are about to ship is actually usable. It's sort of like it improves UAT feedback cycle. So that's why I'm wondering whether you also saw and observed any benefits of combining automation end-to-end, so through discovery to delivery to like sort of end of cycle with feedback and testing all in one tool.
Yeah, I mean, I think as long as the agents are able to navigate between the kind of like product insights and the engineering insights, as long as that happens, it kind of achieves that goal. At the end of the day, what you're doing is putting context in like an agent traversable system. So as long as that happens, it doesn't really matter what the overall tooling is that kind of produces that particularly. Yeah, I think that would be my main
Thank
answer.
you. Thank you.
Yeah. If your customer insight information is stored in a system like HubSpot or Zoho, can you feed that information in? We've never worked with Zoho. We have done some stuff with HubSpot. CRMs in general are a little bit tricky to work with because they tend to have data mapped in like lots of different ways. But yes, we can work with them. It just sometimes takes a little bit of customization to do that. Do you find that the tool provides a great way of pushing back against sales if a request is not aligned to the strategy of the company, i.e. computer says no? Yeah, I think it can do that kind of politely without a PM having to say it like many times. So yeah, I think it is a good way of doing that deliberately or inadvertently, I guess. This feels like a playbook for automating anything. Is that right? Or are there specific things to watch out for in product? I think it's a playbook for automating PM pieces. We like really try and focus on that vertical because what the product brain is instructed to do in terms of its prompting is to understand the product. It's not trying to understand like other parts of the business, how well your sales teams are conducting their sales interviews or anything like that. And then the workflows that we typically support are insights. So that means like, kind of anomalies in data or like customer insights, work insights. So what are your engineering teams doing? And then the end-to-end like product development flow. So, idea through to trying to ship code. There's actually quite a lot more that we have heard that I would say we haven't started tackling yet because those are the ones that most of the people we've worked with have asked for, like team alignment, for example. So I'm in team A and I'm going to go talk to the PM of team B, give me a bunch of context about like, what they work on that might relate to our work, and do that proactively, and call it out when there are like more dependencies, etc. We think the system could get there, but it's definitely a more advanced use case, I would say. Does that help, Ed?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't thinking, can you use this, extend this system to do every process in the company, but more, whichever function you're in, the process for automating things seems quite similar. You map the inputs, you figure out how much like human input and judgment you need at different stages, and then you sort of start building it up
Yeah.
incrementally.
Yeah, that's true. We also haven't done a huge amount with mobile apps either. But
Mm.
yeah, because they've got their own kind of inputs and analytics and flows as well. So yeah, TBD on that front. Have you had any pushback from clients' legal or IT departments about implementing AI in this way, e.g., concerns about PII making it into tickets? Yes, we have had that as a concern. We can anonymize the data. It's just that it becomes substantially kind of less useful in that case. And you can kind of run like an anonymization process if the specific concern is about the data being stored in GitHub. For example, then you can run that anonymization kind of in front of it and as stuff comes out of it. In terms of like the PII making it into tickets, I guess that's been less of the concern. It's been more about just like kind of like customer insights and another place that people are storing them. I think a lot of companies already store the fact that like company Y requested feature Z. So that's the kind of PII that gets stored as part of this process. And then next question was about context rot. Yes. So what we are early on in doing is we have what we call a like librarian agent that runs over the top of product brain periodically, much less frequently than like the input processor. And basically what that does is aiming to do two things. It keeps stuff fresh, but it also makes sure the structure of the product brain is organized so that it's working for the way that the company is using it, basically. But I'm sure that this will need to be a like very continual area of like tweaking and tuning and that kind of thing. All right. Cool. I think that's all the questions on the chat. Any live questions that folks wanted to ask? All right. Cool. Yeah, always happy to chat about this stuff. So yeah, please feel free to get in touch.
Emma, thank you so much. That was super, super interesting. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I could chat a lot longer about this, but I'd just be asking the same questions in more detail. But yeah, really interesting to hear how you're thinking about this and what you're doing. So really appreciate you coming and sharing those thoughts with us.
Yeah, thank you so much. All right, thanks everyone. Good one.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.